I'm just curious about your perspective, Aaron, because I think one thing I've found quite common when discussing utilitarianism
Hmm.
is thought experiments.
Yeah.
And I'm just curious about your take on thought experiments versus looking at real life situations like the Impossible Burger and the 188 rats. I mean, do you think thought experiments are helpful outside? I mean, I appreciate what you said earlier about, in a philosophical discord, maybe some of those things help exercise the mind and so forth and test theories. I'm just curious if that also has merit for animal advocacy specifically. Are they helpful, or are they a bit of a distraction?
Yeah, so I think thought experiments are useful tools for some kinds of things. So, for example, I think so I've given lots of talks about um, why we should abolish vivisection. I've given all other talks about like why we should abolish animal agriculture completely. Everybody should be like nobody should be eating animals. And when I'm doing that, I'm using thought experiments. Like often I'll use like modifications of Alistair Norcross's thought experiment with you know, the pup from this famous paper, Puppies, Pigs, and People. So I think that thought experiments can serve a fantastic, like, pedagogical role. And I think that they're also useful for examining the implications of some of our theories. So, for example, one thought experiment that Singer gives to Regan, and I guess Singer responds to Regan with, is the idea of like a lifeboat case. So, if you have a dog and a human in a lifeboat, and no injustice led to those individuals being on the lifeboat, um, and everybody's going to die if you don't throw somebody off the lifeboat. Regan thinks that you should throw the dog off the lifeboat. And his decision procedure is to say that um, no matter how many dogs and how many humans are on the lifeboat, if the question is just like, you know, should we throw this individual off the lifeboat? Once you've gotten rid of all the injustices of them arriving on the lifeboat, um, there's you should be prepared to sacrifice infinite dogs to save the life of one human, and that follows out of the rights approach, at least in Reagan's view, because there's no violation of this respect principle that he's defending. On Singer's view, on the other hand, he'd say that there's a number of dogs that you should not sacrifice to, just to save one human. Maybe the number is one, maybe the number is two, maybe the number is six. You'd have to have a debate about what the exact number is. But I think that like thought experiments are useful because I think what they can do is they can show us that all of our views often have counterintuitive, implications when we really, take them to the extreme. And I think we can learn a lot about our views through these thought experiments. The other thing I think thought experiments do is it allows us to examine the intuitive plausibility of like policy proposals, like sort of the real world cash value of these moral theories. And if we hear a thought experiment and we're horrified, I think that's a really good reason to not base policies, off of it. But I don't think that tells us very much about whether the theory is actually correct at the level of right action, because I don't think that our intuitions like were made for that purpose. I don't think like our our faculties of having intuitions are really very good at figuring out what the moral truth is. But I do think they're very good at figuring out which ways of organizing our society are going to be better for us in the long run.
Yeah, and I guess the reason I ask is, I guess from my perspective, if animal use isn't necessary, we're not going to find ourselves on a lifeboat. So
Mm-hmm.
while I think they are kind of helpful, like you say, to structure our thought process, I just struggle to kind of link them to my day-to-day advocacy and how my decision in the lifeboat scenario would translate to my animal advocacy where I'm trying to end all use because it's not necessary, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I totally agree, and I think that that's the problem with using thought experiments. So it's a good tool for some things, and I think that when you look at that lifeboat scenario and you're horrified by it, I think what that would tell you is that in our actual advocacy, maybe that's not the principle to endorse. And in fact, it might be dangerous to talk about that principle to him. Like it might be dangerous to spend too much time thinking about those thought experiments because it can lead us down the wrong path. Same with utilitarianism. I think that when people think a lot about like trolley problems, and then they go out and they have to make decisions in the real world, they can run into problems because now they're not actually in a trolley problem. Like in the real world, we have choices. There's ways that we can minimize risk. Like you don't have to go around pushing people in front of trolleys or carving them up and harvesting their organs, right? And so I, you know, I'm really suspicious about thought experiments for the same reason that I think you are. The other thing I want to add, though, is like, one thing you mentioned earlier, Jeremy, was that you think that rights are there to protect the interests of individuals. And if that's your view, come out over to the utilitarian side. We have those kinds of rights. We're full of those kinds of rights. What we say is rights are extrinsically valuable. They are these extremely crucial social constructions that are useful and necessary for protecting the most basic interests of all sentient individuals. And we can even say that we shouldn't engage in these calculations of overall well-being. What's better often, not always, but often, is to think about inviolable rights, simply because if we don't do that, we're not going to actually protect the most important interests of individuals.
Yeah, I was actually thinking the same as you're describing that too. I'm like, this is sounding quite rights-based. And I think it's really interesting to tease out the difference between the two. That's kind of the whole spirit today. Roger, it looked like you wanted to add something earlier.
Yeah,
and then I know we've got, I think Ollie was logging out and back in, who had X'd a while back.
Well, in relation to what Aaron just said, that was really interesting. Francione once claimed that sometimes real life, as it were, makes you make utilitarian, calculations. And from what Aaron just said, that sometimes the situation would probably make you make a kind of definitive kind of rights-based kind of decision. Going back to the 1 million dogs thing, the lifeboat scenario, in defense of Regan there, we have to remember, first of all, that appears from a 1983 text. And it is true that Regan was being very conservative when it came to writing that. He actually kind of admits that, in the sense that he wanted the theory to be assessed and thought of, and so not to get kind of almost like stymied at the very beginning. And so subjective life was drawn very conservatively. And so, yeah, you did get this problem of non-aggregation in the rights-based thing. And so it would be true that one dog would be put against one human, and then the dog would be thrown over, and then the next, and so you would end up then with 1 million dogs being thrown overboard, because it would be like, as it were, one at a time, as Aaron just suggested. It's often forgotten by people who criticize Regan for that he did state that it could be the other way around in given circumstances. He did say in an article, and in fact, I think it was a debate that he had with Regan on something, and I'm sure Aaron would probably be aware of this, that in given circumstances, you would throw 1 million humans overboard in order to save one dog. So he was kind of being consistent, but without being speciesist. It's just that at the time there was always this thing about human exceptionalism, and Regan wouldn't have argued with that. In fact, there is an audio of Regan on the Moral Maze, which I think was dated from the 1990s, where he does say that we are exceptional beings, in the sense that we are moral agents rather than moral patients. And that is a kind of burden that we have to bear, in the sense that we're not allowed just to do our own thing. Because we're morally aware, we've got to then therefore think morally about what we're doing, which is kind of anarchistic as well in terms of that.
Well, and I think to that point, Pamela just asked a question specifically around the 1 million dogs thing. Basically, if there were 10 dogs in this scenario who were super intelligent, much loved, and one human in a persistent vegetative state or brain dead, and basically just trying to understand the purpose of the thought experiment.
Yeah, that's the given circumstances that I was talking about. Ironically, when Regan was asked that once in an interview, he said something about, well, if the dog was real smart and the human wasn't, then you would, as it were, sacrifice the human, and the counter movements jumped all over that. Thought that was an excellent kind of way of proving that we're terrible human beings, because there would be a circumstance when you would choose the non-human over the human, which of course, them being speciesists, they never would. Yeah, so that is true. Yeah, that it's a question of looking at the assumed capabilities of the individuals in this scenario.
Right. And just to so the if people want to see the full debate between Singer and Regan, like on this point, it's a New York Review of Books, 1985, and it was this thing called The Dog and the Lifeboat Exchange. I would definitely recommend that. I just want to sort of, I think what Singer might say in response to all this is that there's still something really pernicious about saying that we're just going to go one by one and not ever aggregate. Where if you had 6 really unintelligent humans, you'd want to sacrifice all of them, or like 6 unhealthy humans. You'd want to sacrifice all of them, not just all of them, but an infinite number of them, to save one healthier human or one healthier dog. And again, I'm like, given what I've said about thought experiments earlier, I don't think you should reject Reagan's view on the basis of that. I think that that just might be a bullet you have to bite. You just have to kind of say like, yeah, it has this counterintuitive implication. But I think the reason I want to bring that up though is that for both Singer and Reagan, we get implications of their views when we put them in thought experiments that do seem counterintuitive. I think it does seem counterintuitive that we would aggregate and do this replaceability thing. But I also think it seems counterintuitive that we always take the cases one by one rather than in aggregation, and that once we have different levels of whatever principles you think lead to harm, that you would sacrifice any number of the individuals who would have lower welfare with that metric than one number of an individual with higher welfare on that metric.